Silent enormity. In a quiet corner of a Yeller empire, where bureaucracy moved slower than light, a single human woman stood at the center of what would become the most significant war in galactic history. Clara Connor had never intended to start a war. She was a traitor, a damn good one, navigating the tangled mess of interstellar commerce with a sharp tongue and sharper instincts. She had survived cutthroat dealings with the Anov cartel, outdrunk an Abor-Vacan diplomat, and once smuggled an entire colony's worth of coffee beans past a Yeller inspection team without them suspecting a thing. But she had never once thought her life or death would change the fate of the entire galaxy. She had landed on Draz, a Yeller-controlled trade hub, to do what she did best: haggle, barter, and make a tidy profit. The Yeller, tall, reptilian humanoids with a rigid caste system, tolerated human traders in their space, but only just. They saw humans as unpredictable, brash, and lacking the proper respect for authority. They weren't wrong. Clara had been wrapping up a deal with a Yeller merchant, a hulking bureaucrat named Vorzan, whose attitude was as oily as his scales, when things went south. It started, as these things often did, with a misunderstanding. The Yeller operated on a system of formal etiquette so dense it made ancient Earth diplomacy look like ordering takeout. Clara, however, operated on common sense and a Taz-sized ego. "You insult me, human," Vorzan hissed, his slit pupil eyes narrowing. Clara raised an eyebrow, arms crossed. "What, because I asked if you could knock 5% off the delivery fee? You question the price set by my noble house?" he snapped, his voice echoing in the busy trade center. "This is a grave offense," Clara rolled her eyes. "Buddy, I don't care if your great-great-grand lizard set the prices himself, it's highway robbery." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Yeller merchants and workers backed away as though an explosion were imminent. Vorzan's forked tongue flicked in agitation. "This is unacceptable," he declared. "You will kneel and offer a proper apology." Clara laughed. Not a nervous chuckle or a diplomatic smirk. A full-bodied, unfiltered human laugh. "Not happening, Chief. If you think I'm getting on my knees over a price dispute, you must have inhaled too much recycling vent gas." That was when the guards arrived. They wore the gleaming black armor of the Imperial Enforcement Bureau, their energy rifles raised, their presence making it clear this was no longer a simple argument. A low-ranking noble like Vorzan didn't have the authority to order an execution, but the guards didn't need much of a reason to use force. "Step forward, human," the lead officer said. "By insulting a noble's honor, you have violated the Yeller Trade Conduct Code." Clara scoffed. "Oh, please. You guys just make this stuff up as you go along." It didn't matter what she said. The moment those guards had arrived, the situation had escalated beyond her control. She was an outsider. She was human. And she had dared to laugh in the face of their authority. The order was given. The guards moved. And Clara Connor, who had once punched a Borean pirate so hard he rethought his life choices, fought back. She moved fast, dodging the first officer's grab and sending a boot directly into the second one's knee joint. He staggered, caught off guard. The other guards surged forward. Clara ducked, weaving through their strikes, her instincts honed by years of dealing with beings twice her size and 3 times as arrogant. For a moment, she almost thought she could make it. Then came the stun blast. Pain surged through her body as she collapsed to the floor, muscles locking, vision swimming. The guards descended on her, dragging her to her knees. Vorzan stood over her, gloating. "You should have complied, human." Clara, still gasping from the stun blast, spat at his feet. That sealed her fate. Through the lead, Yeller battleship shields like wet paper, tearing through its hull and exiting out the other side in a fiery explosion. The war had begun. The Yeller were not known for leniency. They had executed their own kind for lesser insults. A human, defiant and unbowed, had no chance. The crowd barely reacted as the energy lance was raised. To them, this was routine. Just another foolish outsider learning the hard way. Clara Connor met her end not with a scream, but with a smirk. Her last words, broadcast across the trade hub security feeds and intercepted by 1,000 different networks, were simple. "Y'all are screwed." The news reached Earth in hours. The Yeller expected diplomatic outrage. They expected humans to protest, maybe demand an inquiry, but ultimately fall in line. They didn't understand humanity at all. Within minutes, Clara Connor became a martyr. Her face was plastered across every human newsfeed. Her story transformed from a business dispute into an act of murder by a tyrannical empire. The words, "Y'all are screwed," became a rallying cry. Memes flooded the net. But this wasn't just internet outrage, it was personal. Clara hadn't been a soldier or a politician. She had been one of them. A traitor, a free spirit, a woman just trying to carve her way through the stars. Her death wasn't just unjust, it was unacceptable. Johnson's lips curled into a grin as he opened a fleet-wide comm. "All right, boys and girls, let's make some history." The first shot fired was not a plasma bolt, not a laser beam, but a tungsten rod the size of a bus, launched from the USS Chuck Norris's railgun. It punched through the lead Yeller battleship's shields like wet paper, tearing through its hull and exiting out the other side in a fiery explosion. The war had begun. Through the first Yeller battleship, shields crumbled like wet tissue paper. The projectile exited through the other side and kept going, eventually embedding itself in a nearby moon. The Yeller hesitated. That was their mistake. The humans did not hesitate. They were humans. The USS Last Call opened fire. Missiles streaked through the void like vengeful comets, their payloads not just high explosives but electronic warfare packages that blinded Yeller sensors with every pop culture reference, meme, and outdated internet virus humanity had ever produced. Yeller commanders screamed orders. Orders that nobody could understand, because their comms were suddenly flooded with audio clips of Arnold Schwarzenegger quotes and a never-ending loop of Rick Astley singing "Never Gonna Give You Up." Confusion turned into carnage. The USS Freebird barrel-rolled directly through an enemy formation, its engines overclocked so aggressively that half the crew was half-conscious from the G-forces. The pilot, Callahan Mad Dog Reese, yelled, "Screw physics," before manually overriding the safety limiters. One Yeller ship, unable to process the sheer recklessness of human maneuvers, attempted to autocorrect its course and accidentally sideswiped one of its own cruisers. The USS Yi Cannon, a former research station turned makeshift artillery platform, fired an entire volley of hyper-accelerated junk, discarded space debris, broken satellites, even an old microwave. The Yeller energy shields, designed to handle predictable plasma fire, had no countermeasures against high-velocity space trash. More Yeller ships exploded. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted only 40 minutes before the surviving Yeller ships began retreating in full panic. Jonas Johnson watched their engines flicker as they fled, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Lieutenant Hayes stretched, popping her knuckles. "Well, that was fun," Johnson sighed. "Yeah, too easy." Hayes frowned. "You think they'll wise up?" Johnson leaned back in his chair, watching the distant stars. "Maybe, but it won't matter." "Why's that?" He smirked. "Because we haven't even gotten started." The Yeller Empire had never known true fear. They had ruled with iron authority for centuries, spreading their influence across the stars with careful diplomacy and overwhelming force when necessary. No species had ever dared to challenge their dominance, at least, not with any measure of success. Until now. The aftermath of Vorprime's destruction sent shockwaves through the Empire. What had once been a flourishing military outpost was now a charred wasteland, wiped from existence by a hunk of rock and human spite. The battle that followed had only deepened the humiliation. Dozens of Yeller warships, reduced to debris, their once revered navy scattered like frightened prey. On the bridge of the Imperial war fortress Jean Vache, Grand Strategist Exort Tal stood in cold silence, his claws flexing against the ornate console before him. The Yeller, for all their power, were a race that relied on order, on patterns, on structure. The humans possessed none of these things. Their fleets did not move in elegant formations. They did not adhere to the honor codes of war. They fought like wild animals, unpredictable and relentless. "The human fleet has taken the Gornak Belt," a junior officer reported, his scales twitching in barely concealed fear. "They've established forward operating bases on 3 of the largest asteroids." Exort Tal clenched his jaw. The Gornak Belt had once been considered impassable for large-scale fleets. Too many unstable rock formations, too many gravitational anomalies. The humans had not cared. They had moved in, turned the hazardous conditions into an advantage, and repurposed an entire asteroid field into a mine-laden death trap for Yeller patrols. And they weren't just winning battles. They were making a spectacle out of it. Reports had begun filtering through Imperial networks, human soldiers broadcasting their victories live, turning war into a reality show for their own people. One battle had been accompanied by a loud, inexplicable song called Highway to Hell. Another featured a human pilot dogfighting with a yeller ace while eating a sandwich, laughing the entire time. This was no conventional war. This was entertainment, and the humans were having the time of their lives. Exortal slammed a fist against the console. Where is our retaliation? What of our counteroffensive? The officer hesitated before answering. Our forces engaged the humans at the ISO relay station 3 days ago. Exortal narrowed his gaze. And? The officer swallowed hard. They, hijacked our own orbital platforms. Exort's frills stiffened. Explain. They dropped the platforms onto our fleet. Silence stretched across the command deck. Exortal exhaled through his nostrils. They used our own defenses as weapons against us. Yes, strategist. Exort's claws tightened, didn't even register it as an attack. By the time they realized what it was already too late. On Blore Prime, planetary defense systems remained still. There was no alert, no scramble of fighters. Nothing. The Empire's pride had made them blind to the possibility that anyone could be insane enough to weaponize an asteroid in a first strike. When it hit, it did not just hit, it rewrote the landscape. The explosion drowned out the sky. A firestorm of metal and vaporized rock that turned the primary Yeller military outpost into a crater the size of a continent. The seismic shock sent tsunamis rippling across the planet's oceans. Cities collapsed. And within seconds, Blore Prime's planetary governor was atomized, before he could even finish screaming into his communicator. The Empire panicked. Yeller command centers across the sector scrambled for answers. What had just happened? Was this a freak accident? A rogue meteor? Their confusion lasted exactly 3 minutes, right up until the moment the human fleet dropped out of FTL. The ironclad, leading the charge, tore into the system like an apex predator unleashed into a herd of prey. It was not sleek, nor was it graceful. It was a battleship, made by a species that had spent its entire history figuring out new and exciting ways to kill things. Its hull was layered with armor plating, taken from decommissioned planetary defense stations. Its main cannons fired slugs the size of cars, at velocities that defied most ethical weapon conventions. Jonas Johnson cracked his knuckles as he surveyed the fleet's formation. Every ship had a name that struck either fear or confusion. The USS Chuck Norris, a retrofitted mining vessel armed with a railgun so powerful it had to fire at half charge to avoid tearing itself apart. The USS Freebird, whose pilots were notorious for playing Lynyrd Skynyrd over open comms whenever they engaged in battle. The USS Last Call, a former cargo hauler whose crew had strapped enough missile pods to its hull that it looked like an orbital fireworks display. The Yeller fleet scrambled to respond. They had ships, sleek, curved monstrosities with technology polished over centuries of refinement. But refinement didn't mean prepared. Their ships moved in formation, following rigid, calculated tactics, relying on predictable patterns. The humans, on the other hand, had a strategy best described as absolute, unfiltered chaos. He had studied 1,000 war doctrines, memorized every conflict in the history of the known galaxy, yet none of those histories had prepared him for humans. He turned sharply. Send word to the Emperor. We require immediate reinforcement. The officer hesitated again. There is another matter, he said carefully. Exortal's patience was wearing thin. Speak. The officer's throat bobbed. The humans have deployed a new division. Exortal scoffed. A single division? What could they possibly? They are called the Florida Brigade. The room fell quiet. Even those unfamiliar with the details of the war reports could hear the hesitation in the officer's voice. Exort frowned. And what makes this unit significant? The officer hesitated. Then, instead of answering, he played a video feed from a battlefield on Xenoph 7, a jungle world deep within Yeller territory. The footage was grainy, but the chaos was unmistakable. A Yeller outpost, once a fortified position, was now engulfed in flames. Human soldiers, their armor mismatched and their weapons heavily customized, rampaged through the streets like lunatics. One of them rode what appeared to be a massive reptilian beast, wrangled from the local wildlife. Another wielded a makeshift flamethrower, made from stolen Yeller fuel cells. A third, bare-chested, covered in war paint, and wearing sunglasses despite the night setting, was wielding a chainsaw. There was no coordination in their attack, only absolute, relentless destruction. And then came the audio. The soldiers were screaming something over their external speakers, something so bizarre and cryptic that the Yeller intelligence teams had struggled to decipher it. One phrase, however, was clear. "Yaw, sockers." Exortal watched the footage in stunned silence. They are mad," he whispered. "Yes, strategist," the officer agreed. "And they cannot be stopped." Exortal turned away from the screen, his mind racing. The war was spiraling out of control, and the humans were only escalating. They had no intention of stopping, no desire for negotiations. They wanted to break the Empire. And the terrifying thing? They were succeeding. Across the stars, the human fleet continued its rampage. The Yeller High Council, once steadfast in their belief that humanity would eventually submit, now found themselves on the defensive. Their pride was shattered. Their military doctrine was useless, and the humans, they were just getting started. The skies above Zelzer Prime, the heart of the Yeller Empire, were burning. The Yeller homeworld, Xerok, had never known war. It was a planet of grandeur, a jewel of architectural perfection, where the Empire's nobility lounged in opulent estates, surrounded by the spoils of their centuries-long conquest. Here wars were something distant, fought in the cold void, never on their own pristine soil. Now it burned. His once commanding voice was now a ragged whisper. You cannot do this," he croaked. "I am Emperor of 1,000 worlds." Briggs took another step. The dull thud of his boots against the marble was the only sound in the chamber. "You were," he said. Zavoraz bared his fangs. "You have no right to this destruction. The laws of war demand." Briggs laughed. A short, bitter laugh. "The laws of war?" he scoffed. "You mean the ones you ignored when you executed an unarmed woman? The ones you abandoned the second you thought we were just another species you could push around?" The Emperor took a step back, the realization dawning in his yellow eyes. There would be no mercy. You will never be accepted," he spat. "The galaxy will not follow humans. They will see you for what you are, barbarians. You revel in chaos, in destruction. You are a species of madness." Briggs tilted his head, considering the words. Then he shrugged. "Maybe," he admitted, "but guess what?" He raised his sidearm. "We win." One shot rang out. The Emperor collapsed in a heap, blood pooling beneath the throne that had once ruled 1,000 worlds. There was ceremony, no grand declaration, just one last, cold shot in a war that had never been about conquest. Only vengeance. Outside, the city burned. The Yeller who remained, soldiers, civilians, bureaucrats, fell to their knees in surrender. Their empire, once thought indestructible, had collapsed in less than a year. The message went out across the stars, carried by human warships and intercepted by every government, every faction watching from the sidelines. The Empire is dead. Humanity has won. 3 weeks later, in a makeshift command center set up in what had once been the Imperial Senate Hall, Johnson stood on a balcony overlooking the ruined skyline. Fires still smoldered in the distance, though most of the fighting had long since ended. Beside him, Sophia Hayes leaned against the railing, sipping from a flask. "So what now?" she asked. "We put up a McDonald's and start handing out green cards." Johnson smirked. "I was thinking of barbecue first," Hayes snorted. "Of course. Can't have a proper victory without brisket." Silence stretched between them, but it was a comfortable silence. A rare moment of peace after the storm. Then, in the distance, a fleet transmission came in. One of the human commanders stationed on a newly conquered Yeller world spoke over the comm. "Hey, Admiral, you ever hear of the Taxer Dominion? Word is they taxed some Earth tourists last year." Johnson exhaled, shaking his head. "Jesus," Hayes grinned. "So war's not over, huh?" Johnson took the flask from her, took a swig, and handed it back. "Nope." And as the war machines of humanity prepared to march once more, he couldn't help but laugh. The human fleet had arrived in force, tearing through the last remnants of the Yeller Armada like a pack of wolves descending on a wounded beast. The imperial capital, a once proud metropolis of towering spires and crystalline walkways, was now a battlefield. From orbit, the USS Ironclad loomed over the planet like a vengeful titan. On the bridge, Admiral Jonas Johnson watched as streaks of plasma and kinetic rounds rained down on the capital below. His fingers tapped absently against the armrest of his command chair, his gaze fixed on the battle reports scrolling across the display. "Their planetary defense grid is failing," Lieutenant Sophia Hayes reported, her voice edged with exhilaration. "Ground forces are already inside the Palace District. The Emperor's running out of places to hide." Johnson exhaled, leaning back. "They thought we'd negotiate, thought we'd offer terms." His lips curled into a smirk. "They really don't know us." The Yeller had tried everything. Diplomats had begged, envoys had pleaded, but there were no more deals left to make. Not after what they had done. Not after Cleric Connor's execution had been broadcast to the galaxy. Humanity's war machine had been unleashed, and it would not stop until the last shred of the Empire was reduced to nothing but history and regret. Down on the surface, the battle raged. In the shadow of the Imperial Palace, Yeller shock troopers, once feared across the stars, were being driven back by human soldiers who fought like devils, who laughed in the face of overwhelming odds. The palace gates, built to withstand sieges for centuries, were breached in minutes, not by heavy artillery, not by precision strikes, but by a stolen Yeller tank, repainted with a crude human skull, barreling through the entrance at full speed before detonating in a massive fireball. Smoke poured through the corridors as the final defenders mounted a last, desperate stand. Plasma fire streaked through the grand halls, ricocheting off marble columns. Human soldiers pushed forward, their movements erratic, fearless, methodical in their destruction. At the heart of the palace, in the throne chamber, Emperor Zavoraz, the last ruler of the Yeller Empire, sat hunched on his grand obsidian throne. His scales were dulled with age, his robes, once a magnificent gold, now tarnished with sweat. His advisors were dead, his guards scattered. Outside, the screams of his people echoed through the halls. The great doors burst open. Through the smoke and rubble stepped Major Nathan Briggs. His battle-worn armor was smeared with soot, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. His gait was slow, deliberate, like a man who knew the fight was already won. His squad followed behind him, battle-hardened soldiers, humans who had carved their way through an empire with nothing but grit, rage, and an utter disregard for intergalactic rules of engagement. The Emperor rose, his talons trembling.